Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of the Future Kings program. For those of you who are tuning in for the very first time, Future Kings is a program where we say we are engineering great futures. We're doing that as a way of using STEM education to change communities, and we are teaching college-level material to young men who are in secondary school. In this case, secondary school means grades 6 to 12. This evening we are with Mr. Boris Willis, an associate professor of the computer game department at George Mason University. We, in Future Kings, are teaching college-level material to young men in secondary school, and Mr. Willis is leading our computer game design department. As a tenured professor at George Mason University, he is able to bring a wealth of knowledge and creativity to our program, and he's a very, very valuable and critical contributor to our program. So, Mr. Willis, welcome.
Thank you.
We're very glad to have you both in our program and here tonight. And we would just like to talk to you about both you as an individual, as well as the game design program at George Mason, and in my opinion, the most important part is the computer game design program of Future Kings.
Right.
So where I'd like to start tonight is for you to tell us something about you, your background, and how you came to be a contributor, how you came to volunteer your services in order to support the Future Kings program.
Yes. So I began my life thinking about dance, thinking about being a dancer, being a choreographer. And so that's what I pursued as a young man. And also in high school, I was also interested in video games. Now, this was back in the days of Atari. And so I remember very well thinking, how does one do this? How does one learn to make video games? I grew up in a really small town in North Carolina, so there wasn't anything like that.
And for our boys, if you talked about Atari or Commodore 64, they wouldn't have a clue what that's about.
Right. So I was lucky enough that my parents bought me my first computer, which was an Atari 400. And with that came a BASIC program, learning the computer program BASIC. But it wasn't a very good version of BASIC, and I didn't really have any materials to really teach me how to learn BASIC or how to use BASIC, except for the basic ones that came in the box. And so, back in those days, you get a magazine, and the magazine would have the code, and then you type out all the code, and then once you've typed out all the code, then you hope and pray that it worked, and then, did I know how to debug? No. Did I know how to search for problems? No. But that was always something that was interesting to me, both game design and dancing. But luckily for me, there was the ability to take dance class, and I was lucky enough to be able to find a dance teacher in the next town over, and I studied dance in college at the North Carolina School of the Arts. And as the 90s sort of rolled around, I became interested in computers again and interested in computer games again. I had sort of abandoned that during the time I was learning dance and my first few dance jobs. And then I came back to it and started looking at animation. And at the same time, I started teaching at George Mason University as a dance instructor, and was lucky enough to meet a gentleman by the name of John Simmons, who was working with animation and dance over the internet. So it was the internet was new. This dance tool that he created was called ADEL, which stood for the Animated Dance Event Language. And we worked together on creating on this thing that we were going to call humanizing the web. So how do you take the basically what you see now with Memojis. That was our idea back with Netscape and Cosmo Player plugin. Yeah, exactly. So that was my interest, and then again, I was interested in other kinds of technology, video. I was very interested in the program at Ohio State, where they were doing a lot of stuff online with video, and eventually I did go there for grad school, looking mostly at dance and technology. So those two were the things that I was most interested in. And while I was there, my thesis project was making what I called a live video game. So it used performance, it used music composed by David Morneau. He composed it on a Nintendo Game Boy. I had other artists that were working with me. I had people writing scripts and texts. But basically we created sort of like a game show inside of a performance, and the audience members played video games to enhance and advance the storyline. And so that was really sort of my going from high school to grad school, and sort of combining all those things together, using video, using performance, and using games all together as one. And then I got invited then I was shopping this program around, and my mother mentor, Linda Miller, as the game program was starting up at George Mason, said, hey, since you're interested in coming back to Mason, why don't you teach part-time in the game program, which is new, and part-time in the dance program. So for a while, I taught in both dance and game. So those two things have been a big part of my life.
And so that's why you decided to volunteer some time with Future Kings?
Well, so in that regard, I've always felt the need and desire to give back. My educational path, it was sort of fraught with the constant potential to fail. And I feel like I had to employ some unique strategies so that wouldn't happen. And as a result, I learned a lot about myself, but I also learned a lot about these systemic structures that are designed to make someone who looks like me fail. And I have always felt like I wanted to at least be able to say to a young person, you don't have to fail, or you don't have to feel like you can't make it in the world if you do two things. One is don't give up. And everything that I've ever read from any successful person is that don't give up. The other is to understand how to overcome the challenges that you're facing. Mm-hmm. And how you overcome them, could be a lot of different ways. But I wanted to share my information, to share my story, and Future Kings is a great way to do that. Having seen the boys, talk to the boys, and realizing that there is a lot of ways that I can contribute and share what I've done and learned in my life.
And again, I'll say we're very happy to have you. Okay.
Thank you.
Now, I've heard you talk about convergence, and in the story you told, convergence was one of the tools. Could you expound on convergence as a practice, but also how you see it tying into the work you're going to do, your work you're doing with Future Kings?
Yeah. So in the early 2000s, this was the idea of the word convergence was talked about a lot, because this was technologically when things were starting to go from separate devices to contiguous devices. So the Trio smartphone, for instance, was a device that could have apps, and so it had a camera, it had a keyboard, it had a screen, it was a phone, and it was, those personal PDA, personal handheld devices. And so the idea that all of these things were being able to combine into one technology was very interesting to me, because I had different interests as well. So convergence for me was not only those devices, but also my interest in the arts. So being a dancer, being somebody who worked with film and video, and also someone who was interested in gaming. So what I really was looking at was like, hey, can I do all the things that I'm interested in doing, as opposed to just having to focus on one? And that's what I did initially. I focused on dance. And then at a certain point, I wanted to bring all those elements together. So for me, the idea of convergence is bringing video into the game world, bringing dance into the game world, bringing games into the dance world. And so for me, it's like there's a lot of things so if you look at that I'm sort of have been practicing these three main art forms, that I don't have to abandon one for another, but I can bring them all together and make them all work together at the same time.
And you work with Spinning Boards and Future Kings.
Yeah.
And this idea of convergence has really intrigued me, because in the age group that they have lots of interests.
Right.
And I see you beginning to encourage them to take these various interests and combine them into one interest.
Yeah.
Maybe you could expound on some ways that maybe you've thought about as a long-term strategy for to get them to not abandon one thing they're interested in, but instead keep all their interests, but just make them one new interest.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a thing that I talk about with my students a lot of the times, that a game is a text. It is something that you look at and it holds information. It could be a clay tablet, it could be a book, it could be a video or a movie, but it is something that you can look at and get information from. So in games, games is a methodology, a way of learning something and failing at something. So you fail to learn and you learn by failing. So I really think that if you think about what a game is in terms of the experience, right? You're creating an experience for someone. What does that experience entail? Well, often students want to create games that they play, right? Which is completely normal. But I encourage them to make games about things that they're interested in already, things that they've studied and have expertise in. So a student, for instance, outside of school might be really interested in singing or bowling or theology. Whatever it is that they're interested in, they can bring that as an idea into the game world, and they can make a game around those ideas. So not to look at games as, having to make a platformer, but as a way of expressing themselves as people, as a way of talking about what they already know and like. You can make a sports game where you play sports, or you can make a sports games where you can find a way to look at your unique perspective on sports. So you don't have to think about making the games that you play, but you can expand the text of the game into anything you want it to be. So that's one of the things that I try to encourage my students to do, is to not get locked down into I've seen it as a game, therefore I should make that. But here's the thing that I know and I love, and I'm going to turn that thing into a game.
Some of our parents and even more adults in general, when they think about a game, they think about some of the entertainment games where there is a lot of shoot 'em up violence. They see their kids, especially their boys, locked in a room all day, playing some type of video game, and that's their only visualization of what a game is. But what you're describing is so much more than that. It is a way of, your definition of a game seems to go much more toward a form of self-expression, where you are able to visualize something that would take much more time to have to write or to read. Maybe it takes the same amount of time, but having to read that story would take a lot more time than being able to, say, watch a video of it. And so your description of what a game is not quite, is beyond just being a video. But it is, and it's much more than having text to read. But it is an expression, a creative expression of how this person feels about a number of things that interest them. And so that can really take the edge off of trying to get your son or daughter to come into the gaming field, because what you're teaching them is so much more than that. Now, I know of serious games used by the military to help simulate different environment, or in medicine to simulate different conditions, engineering, aerospace. Practically every professional environment has some type of system that helps with a simulation of real-world experiences. Do you see this convergence, or the things that the boys in Future Kings or other people when coming to computer game design, do you see them going in that type of direction, or do you see it being much more less technical than that and more creative?
Well, the thing about games is that they require all the other arts. So you have to know how to write a compelling document of some sort if people are going to read it effectively. So often, even in the text that I write for instructions, like, there is a way to write an instruction that is difficult and confusing, or there's a way to write an instruction that is clear and can be read in a second, and they have to get it, right? So understanding how to write is extremely important if you're going to make games. Understanding how music works inside of a game, where the music can't just go on forever. At some point, it has to repeat itself in loop. And if you're a composer, then you have to know how to write music in a certain way so that people don't get tired of or get bored by the music as they're hearing it over and over and over again. The same is true for the arts. Making artwork that is interesting, engaging, using things like perspective, having a focus, film techniques for drawing the eye. There's so many things that you can do within a game. It's very, very complex. But that's all in how you're communicating that experience to an audience. So with film, you want to know, a film is more complicated than writing a story, because the story goes onto a page, or even more complicated way is telling it after you've written it. Games can bring all those things together. But it's not just that you bring them all together, but you bring them all together and you're creating from all those elements an experience that is highly technical. And we specialize in certain aspects of it because it's really hard to be really good at all of them. So if you're a really, really good programmer, it's not likely that you're going to be just as good of an artist. it's not likely that you're going to be just as good as of a musician. So working together in different teams, we're learning how to work together in teams, learning how to compromise, bringing all those different aspects of the experience together is sort of because the technology allows for it. And so when you talk about the idea of converging all of these different ideas, that's because we're living in a time when those things can happen in a very sophisticated way. And realism is often about the time that you live in. Mortal Kombat was realistic when it came out, and now it looks very cartoony. Today's realism will probably happen, in 20 years from now. The realism that we see today won't look as real as it will 20 years from now. So for me, it's really interesting to understand that games are a more complicated way of expressing oneself, but those individual parts, as you learn them, as you learn to get good at one aspect or another of them, you use them to create the kind of experience that you want to see.
We have always defined Future Kings as a STEM program. Mm-hmm. Okay. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and your computer game design program is a perfect example of how our Future Kings computer game design program qualifies as a STEM program, because all those elements are required. You need to know math in order to animate, and some of that, there's certainly technology there. You have to engineer the process that you're going to be creating. So all those elements are there. We're almost out of time, but I would like to circle back to something that you briefly touched on before, which is systemic obstacles that boys in our from our background face, whether it be the economic challenges or the societal challenges. Do you see a path for boys in Future Kings who are faced with these structural challenges to be able to use the training that they're getting to help navigate those challenges?
Yeah. So one of the beautiful things about games is it teaches you that failure is okay, and that through failure you learn. And so for me, understanding that my trajectory isn't in the moment. My trajectory is for the future. So one of the things that I learned was that when I was in 7th grade, that I couldn't, as a 7th grader, achieve what I wanted to achieve. I had to look forward to high school. Mm-hmm. And that I knew that I could reinvent myself in high school. So I could sort of take a step back and say, well, I have a certain status right now, but by the time I get to high school, I'm going to figure out where I need to be, so my 5-year plan, if you will. And that in 5 years, who I am now won't really matter because I'm so young that, people won't remember that, or my peers won't remember that. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there are other real obstacles to success. There are political obstacles, there are emotional obstacles, but if you can see beyond the moment, if you can see beyond the now, if you can understand that your failure is a pathway to your success, as opposed to a thing that holds you back or keeps you from succeeding, then I believe that if you have a dream that you can achieve it, you can achieve whatever you want. The time factor is the important thing. So you don't feel like you need to achieve your dream in the moment. Look forward, look ahead, and work very hard towards getting that thing that you want to achieve. And so with Future Kings, I believe that is what's possible here. I think the program that you've set up gives them so many opportunities to look at many different options for what they want to be, for what they can be, and not to be limited by, what happens to them in school or what happens to them at home, but it gives them this other option where they can see the future and see how they can succeed in their lives. And I think that's the beauty of the program itself.
Well, I certainly appreciate both of you being here tonight with us, and even more, I appreciate the contribution you're making to our Future Kings program. With that, we are certainly going to close tonight. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
All right.